My wife was in our bed with her rich CEO. I caught them when I came home early from work trip. He saw me and smirked triumphantly until I told him, "I just sent your wife a video of you two." He was frantic in anger since his wife was. My name is Jude Carter, and I'm about to tell you how my perfectly ordinary Tuesday turned into the kind of train wreck that makes you wonder if God's got a twisted sense of humor or just really bad timing. See, I'd been in Dallas for 3 days, sitting through mind-numbing presentations about quarterly projections and synergistic solutions. Corporate speak that basically translates to, "We have no clue what we're doing, but let's use fancy words." The conference wrapped up early, which should have been my first red flag. Good things happening to me? Yeah, that's usually when life decides to drop-kick me in the teeth. But hey, I was feeling optimistic for once. Maybe even a little proud of myself for thinking ahead. I'd already planned my grand romantic gesture. Swing by Mrs. Petrov's corner flower shop, grab some of those roses Sienna always goes nuts for, and surprise my wife with an early homecoming. You know, the kind of cheesy move that works in rom-coms, but probably makes real women roll their eyes. Still, I figured I'd earn some husband points after being gone for 3 days of essential business development. Translation: I sat in hotel conference rooms eating stale bagels and pretending to care about market penetration strategies. The cab ride from the airport was classic Austin weird. Tund, my driver, spent the entire 20-minute trip bragging about his niece making varsity volleyball, showing me grainy photos on his cracked phone screen while weaving through traffic like he was auditioning for Fast and Furious, Soccer Dad Edition. She got the height from her mama's side, he kept saying. But the killer instinct? That's pure Tund genetics right there. I nodded and made appropriate impressed noises because, honestly, the guy's enthusiasm was infectious. Plus, after 3 days of corporate zombies, hearing someone genuinely excited about family felt refreshing as hell. Our little Austin bungalow looked picture-perfect from the street, just like always. The oak tree we planted when we first moved in was doing its thing, the porch light was on, and everything screamed, "Welcome home, devoted husband." I should have known something was off right then and there. In my experience, when things look too perfect, it's usually because someone's working overtime to make sure you don't peek behind the curtain. But I was riding high on my surprise homecoming plan, clutching those roses like they were going to solve all our recent, let's call them communication issues. The front door unlocked with its usual sticky protest, and I stepped inside expecting the familiar smell of Sienna's vanilla candles and maybe some leftover takeout. Instead, the air felt wrong, thick and charged, like the atmosphere before a Texas thunderstorm. You know that feeling when you walk into a room and your gut immediately starts sending up flare signals? Yeah, that was happening in stereo. But my brain, being the optimistic idiot it apparently is, decided to override my instincts. Maybe she was upstairs taking a bath. Maybe she'd be thrilled to see me early. Maybe I was just paranoid from too much airport coffee and conference room fluorescent lighting. Then I saw it. Draped over our living room chair like it owned the place was a suit jacket I'd never seen before in my life. And not just any jacket. This thing was clearly expensive, the kind of tailored perfection that screams, "I make more in a month than you make in a year." Hand-stitched initials on the inside pocket caught my eye, AV. My stomach dropped faster than a lead balloon, but I kept moving, kept climbing those stairs with my suitcase in one hand and those suddenly ridiculous roses in the other. Each step felt like walking through quicksand. Part of me wanted to turn around, walk right back out that door, and pretend I'd never seen the jacket. Just get back in a cab, fly back to Dallas, and live in blissful ignorance for a few more hours. But the other part, the part that apparently hates me, needed to know. Needed to see exactly how spectacular this disaster was going to be. I reached our bedroom door, and for a split second, I hesitated. This was it. The moment that was going to divide my life into before and after. I could hear movement inside, low voices, the kind of sounds that make your blood turn to ice water. My hand was shaking as I turned that doorknob, and I swear I could feel my heart trying to pound its way out of my chest. And there they were. My wife, Sienna Hale, in our bed, our goddamn bed. With Adrian Voss, the smug CEO of Voss Dynamics. The same Adrian Voss who'd been her boss for the past 2 years. The same Adrian Voss whose company Christmas parties I'd attended, making small talk about quarterly earnings while he probably laughed at me behind my back. He glanced over his shoulder when I walked in, and I swear to God, the bastard had the audacity to smirk. Not embarrassed, not apologetic. He looked at me like he'd already won some game I didn't even know we were playing. Now, here's where most people expect the wronged husband to lose his shit, start screaming, maybe throw a few punches. But sometimes, when life hits you with something so monumentally screwed up, your brain just goes into this weird calm mode. Like you're watching it happen to someone else on TV. So I did the only thing that made sense in that moment. I pulled out my phone, hit record, and very calmly said, "I just sent your wife a video of you two." Watching Adrian's face drain of color was almost worth the price of admission. Almost. His phone started buzzing immediately, and in his panic to answer it, the idiot hit speaker by mistake. Marina Voss's voice filled our bedroom, cold, sharp, and absolutely terrifying in its controlled fury. "What am I looking at, Adrian?" 6 words that sliced through the room like a chainsaw through butter. Adrian started stammering some bullshit explanation, but Marina cut him off with surgical precision. "Don't come home." Then the line went dead, leaving us all standing there in the aftermath of what I was pretty sure was the most expensive divorce in Austin history. I looked at Adrian, still naked and now sweating bullets, and told him to get out of my house. Not yelling, not threatening, just stating a fact. He scrambled for his clothes like the place was on fire, which, metaphorically speaking, it was. Sienna whispered my name, soft and broken, like she was trying out some magic word that would undo the last 10 minutes. I didn't answer, couldn't answer, because honestly, what the hell was I supposed to say to that? So there I was, sitting in my kitchen at 3 in the morning, staring at that wall clock like it held the secrets of the universe. Tick, 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 each second stretching out like taffy, reminding me that time keeps moving even when your world just got body slammed into next week. The house felt different now, like the walls themselves were judging me for being such a clueless idiot. How long had this been going on? How many signs had I missed while I was busy being the devoted husband, bringing home flowers, and actually believing my wife when she said she was working late again? My brain started doing that thing where it rewinds the highlight reel of your stupidity in high definition. Those strategy dinners that somehow always ran until midnight. Yeah, real strategic, Jude. The way Sienna suddenly became Fort Knox with her phone, flipping it face down whenever I walked into a room like she was guarding nuclear launch codes instead of probably sexting her boss. And Jesus, the jewelry. That tennis bracelet she claimed was from the team for hitting some quarterly target. I'd actually been proud of her, thinking she was finally getting the recognition she deserved. Turns out the only thing she was hitting was Adrian Voss, and the bracelet was probably his way of saying thanks for services rendered. The coffee maker gurgled to life because apparently my hands had decided to function even though my brain was still processing the fact that my marriage had just exploded like a meth lab. I stood there watching the dark liquid drip into the pot, thinking about how even this simple morning ritual felt different now. Everything was different now. The kitchen table where we'd eaten breakfast together for 5 years, the refrigerator covered in photos of us looking happy and clueless, the stupid ceramic owl salt shaker Sienna bought at some craft fair because she thought it was quirky. All of it was just props in a play I didn't know I was starring in. But sitting there marinating in my own misery wasn't going to solve anything, and honestly, the longer I stayed in that house, the more I felt like I was suffocating in the ghost of my own ignorance. So I did what any rational person would do when their life implodes. I got in my car and drove to confront the other victim in this soap opera disaster. Because if I was going down, I sure as hell wasn't going down alone. Marina Voss lived in one of those pristine townhouses in Tarrytown that screams, "I have money and excellent taste, and I will destroy you with both." The kind of place where the landscaping probably costs more than most people's cars and the doormat is worth more than my monthly mortgage payment. I sat in my car for about 10 minutes, working up the nerve to ring the doorbell, wondering if she already knew what had happened or if I was about to be the bearer of the world's shittiest news. When she opened the door, Marina Voss looked exactly like what you'd expect from someone who could probably buy and sell half of Austin without breaking a sweat. Blazer that probably cost more than my car, hair that defied gravity and physics, and eyes that could cut glass. But here's the thing. She didn't look surprised to see me. She looked like she'd been expecting this visit, which either meant she had psychic powers or Adrian was even dumber than I'd given him credit for. "Mr. Carter," she said, stepping aside to let me in. Not a question, not a greeting, just a statement of fact, like she was checking my name off some invisible list. Her townhouse was everything mine wasn't. Clean lines, expensive everything, and the kind of silence that comes from having enough money to soundproof your life. She led me to her kitchen, which looked like something out of Architectural Digest. All marble countertops and stainless steel appliances that probably had more computing power than NASA. The coffee she made tasted like it cost $50 a cup, rich and smooth, and completely at odds with the fact that we were two strangers whose spouses had just nuked both our lives from orbit. We sat across from each other at her kitchen island, and I swear the marble felt cold enough to freeze my soul, which was probably appropriate given the circumstances. "So," Marina said, wrapping her hands around her cup like it was a weapon she was getting ready to wield. "How long do you think this has been going on?" Straight to the point, no small talk, no pretending this was some social visit. I like that about her already. No bullshit, just business. We started trading information like we were conducting some kind of forensic investigation, which I guess we were. She pulled out her phone and showed me Adrian's calendar. All those client meetings and off-site strategy sessions that lined up perfectly with Sienna's mysterious late nights. I showed her the credit card statements I'd been too trusting to question before. Charges at hotels I'd never heard of, expensive restaurants where apparently my wife was whining and dining herself with my money while screwing her boss. Marina had receipts, literally. Gift purchases that didn't make it home to her, weekend trips to Lake Travis that were supposedly team-building exercises, and a paper trail that painted a picture of two people who thought they were smarter than everyone else. The timeline we constructed was depressingly clear. This thing had been going on for at least 6 months, maybe longer. 6 months of me bringing home flowers while my wife was getting her flowers from someone else, if you catch my drift. But here's what impressed me about Marina Voss. She wasn't crying, she wasn't screaming, she wasn't doing any of the things you'd expect from someone whose husband just got caught with his pants down. She was calculating, methodical, like she was planning a hostile takeover instead of a divorce. When she spoke, her voice was steady as a surgeon's hand, and every word felt deliberate. "I don't believe in screaming matches," she said, refilling our coffee cups with the precision of someone who'd probably never had a hair out of place in her entire life. "They're messy, they're undignified, and most importantly, they don't accomplish anything except making you look unstable in court." The way she said court made it sound like she was already 3 moves ahead in a chess game I was just learning to play. We made a pact right there in her pristine kitchen, sealed with expensive coffee and mutual betrayal. No public scenes, no social media drama, no burning down their offices in fits of rage, just cold, calculated consequences delivered with the kind of precision that would make a Swiss watchmaker weep with envy. She handed me a business card for Amara Quinn, a divorce attorney who, according to Marina, doesn't believe in friendly fire. "She's expensive," Marina warned, "but she's worth every penny." And Jude, she looked at me with those laser-focused eyes. "Don't let them think they can manage this. They made their choice. Now we make ours." Let me tell you something about divorce lawyers. They're like sharks, but with better suits and hourly rates that could finance a small country's GDP. When I walked into the offices of Quinn, Sato, and Brandt, I felt like I was entering some kind of legal fortress where dreams go to die and bank accounts get systematically dismantled. The reception area screamed, "We will destroy your enemies, but it's going to cost you." With its polished hardwood floors, leather furniture that probably cost more than my car, and abstract art that looked like someone threw paint at a canvas and called it a day. Amara Quinn turned out to be exactly what Marina had promised, a legal predator disguised as a professional woman in a power suit that could probably stop bullets. Her handshake was firm enough to crack walnuts, and when she looked at me, I got the distinct impression she was already calculating how many ways she could eviscerate the opposition. Her office was all sharp angles and intimidating law books, the kind of place where justice gets served with a side of financial ruin for whoever's stupid enough to cross her. "So," she said, settling behind her desk like a general preparing for war, "Marina tells me you've got a cheating spouse situation with some interesting complications." The way she said "interesting complications" made it sound like she was ordering her favorite dish at a restaurant. "Let's start with the basics. Any kids?" When I shook my head, She made a note that probably said something like, "No custody battle to complicate the carnage." Shared home. Another note. "Any prenup?" When I said no to that one, I swear I saw her eyes light up like a kid on Christmas morning. Her questions were simple, direct, and designed to strip away all the emotional bullshit and get down to what really mattered: money, assets, and how much damage we could legally inflict on the people who'd screwed us over. She didn't ask how I felt about it, didn't offer tissues or sympathetic looks. This wasn't therapy. This was warfare with filing fees. I handed over the video that had already destroyed Adrian's marriage, along with a thumb drive containing every text message, email, and credit card statement I could get my hands on. Watching her review the evidence was like watching a master chef examine ingredients. She knew exactly what she was working with and how to turn it into something that would leave the opposition begging for mercy. "This is good," she said, which in lawyer speak probably translated to, "We're about to make these idiots wish they'd never been born." Texas isn't a no-fault state, despite what a lot of people think. Adultery matters here, and you've got documentation that would make a forensic accountant weep with joy. She buzzed her assistant, and within minutes, 2 more people appeared in her office like legal reinforcements. Kira, her paralegal, looked like she could organize a military invasion and still have time for a coffee break. She immediately started pulling together a document list that would apparently require more paperwork than buying a house, selling a house, and financing a small business all at the same time. Leo Park, one of the associates, looked fresh out of law school but had the kind of focused intensity that suggested he'd been born to make other people's lives miserable through the creative application of legal statutes. While they worked, Amara explained Texas divorce law like she was teaching a masterclass in legal destruction. "Fault doesn't control everything," she said, "but it sure as hell influences property division, spousal support, and most importantly, leverage. When someone's caught with their pants down, literally, in this case, they tend to be a lot more reasonable about settlement negotiations." She leaned back in her chair, and I could practically see the gears turning in her head as she mapped out our strategy. "Here's what's going to happen. You're going to secure your finances, change every password you've ever used, and move anything valuable to a safe place. You're also going to document everything. Every lie, every excuse, every time she comes home late smelling like expensive cologne. And most importantly, you're not going to do anything stupid at work." That last part hit me like a slap in the face. "What do you mean?" I asked, though I had a sinking feeling I already knew. "I mean, you're not going to confront Adrian Voss in his office. You're not going to send angry emails to the entire company. And you're not going to do anything that makes you look like the unhinged ex-husband," she said, fixing me with a stare that could have melted steel. "Steady wins, Jude. The person who keeps their cool while everyone else is losing their shit is the person who walks away with their dignity and their bank account intact." Leo handed me a stack of papers that looked thick enough to use as a doorstop. "Initial petition," he explained, "along with temporary restraining orders and financial disclosures. We'll have these filed by end of business today." The efficiency was terrifying and oddly comforting at the same time. While my personal life was imploding, at least the legal machinery was moving with clockwork precision. The retainer agreement made my credit card weep, but Marina had been right. You get what you pay for, and what I was paying for was the legal equivalent of a nuclear weapon. Amara's firm didn't mess around, didn't pull punches, and didn't believe in giving the opposition any quarter. When I signed that agreement, I felt like I was enlisting in an army whose only mission was to make sure I came out of this disaster with my dignity and my assets intact. Walking out of that office building, I noticed something weird. The world was still there. I mean, obviously it was still there, but for the past 24 hours, it had felt like my personal apocalypse had somehow frozen everything else in place. But nope, Austin was still Austin. The heat was still making the asphalt shimmer like a mirage. There was still a guy playing violin by the taco stand on the corner, and the smell of fresh tortillas from the food truck was still making my stomach remind me that I hadn't eaten anything since yesterday's airplane peanuts. I bought 2 breakfast tacos from the food truck, chorizo and egg, because if you're going to eat your feelings, you might as well do it right, and sat on a bench watching people walk by with their normal problems and their normal lives. A jogger ran past, probably worried about her mile time. A businessman hurried by, checking his phone and probably stressing about some presentation. A mom pushed a stroller while talking on her phone about soccer practice schedules. All of them blissfully unaware that my marriage had just been officially declared dead and that somewhere across town, Adrian Voss was probably realizing that sleeping with his employee was about to cost him more money than a small country's annual budget. The strangest part was how normal it all felt, like the universe had just shrugged and moved on while I was still trying to process the fact that my entire life had been a lie. She was sitting at our kitchen table when I got home, wrapped around a coffee mug like it was a life preserver. The same table where we'd eaten countless breakfasts together, where she'd done her crosswords every Sunday morning, where I'd proposed to her 3 years ago like some romantic comedy cliché. Now it felt like a negotiation table in some corporate boardroom, complete with the kind of tension that makes your skin crawl and your fight-or-flight instincts start doing jumping jacks. Sienna looked like hell, which I have to admit gave me a tiny spark of satisfaction that I immediately felt guilty about. Her hair was doing that thing where it sticks up in the back when she's been running her hands through it. Her makeup was smeared like she'd been crying for hours, and she was wearing the same clothes from yesterday. Good. At least one of us looked like their world had just been nuked from orbit. "We need to talk," she said without looking up from her mug. And I almost laughed because really? Now she wanted to talk? After 6 months of sneaking around behind my back, after turning our bedroom into her personal adultery headquarters, after making me look like the world's biggest fool? But I didn't laugh because honestly, I was curious to see what kind of Hail Mary bullshit she was going to try to pull out of her ass. I sat down across from her, keeping the table between us like a demilitarized zone, and waited. The silence stretched out like taffy until she finally looked up with those big brown eyes that used to make me forget my own name. Now they just reminded me of how stupid I'd been to trust someone who could lie as easily as breathing. "The papers will be served by Friday," I said, because I figured I might as well cut through whatever performance she was preparing. Her face crumpled like I'd just told her Santa Claus was dead, and the tears started flowing like someone had turned on a faucet. "Jude, please," she started, and here it came, the greatest hits album of cheating spouse excuses. It was a mistake. I was under so much pressure at work, and Adrian was there, and I felt so invisible in our marriage. She was hitting all the classics. The vulnerable woman, the manipulative boss, the neglectful husband who somehow drove her into another man's arms in bed. I let her talk because honestly, I was fascinated by the sheer audacity of it all. She was sitting there trying to rewrite history like I was some kind of idiot who'd just fallen off the turnip truck. According to her revised version of events, I was the villain who'd somehow forced her to cheat by being. What exactly? Too busy with work? Not psychic enough to read her mind? Too trusting to assume my wife wasn't screwing her boss in our bed while I was out of town? When she finally ran out of steam, I pointed upstairs toward our bedroom, the scene of the crime, so to speak. "There is no we to fix," I said, making sure to speak slowly so every word would sink in. "There's me, there's you, and there's the fact that you chose to blow up our marriage for whatever this thing with Adrian was supposed to be." She tried the counseling angle next, which was rich coming from someone who'd been counseling Adrian Voss right out of his pants for the better part of 6 months. "We could try therapy," she said, like our problems were some kind of communication issue that could be solved with a few sessions and some relationship workbooks. "We could work through this together." "No," I said, and the word felt good in my mouth. Clean, simple, final. Then she asked for time, like time was some magical healing potion that would somehow make me forget about finding her naked with her boss in our bed. "Just give me a week," she pleaded, "to show you that I can change, that this doesn't have to be the end of everything." "No," I said again, and this time it felt even better. Finally, she went for broke and asked for just 1 week, not to fix things, but to figure out how to move forward without destroying each other. Which was hilarious because, honey, the destruction had already happened. She'd taken care of that part when she decided our marriage vows were more like guidelines than actual commitments. "No," I said for the 3rd time, and I swear I could see something die in her eyes. The hope, maybe, or the delusion that she could somehow talk her way out of the consequences of her choices. She nodded like she understood, but I could tell she didn't really get it. She was still thinking like someone who believed that explanations could undo actions, that the right combination of words could somehow rewind time and make yesterday's disaster disappear. But that's not how life works, and it's definitely not how adultery works. She went upstairs to pack, and I have to give her credit. She was efficient. 20 minutes later, she came back down with 2 suitcases and a look on her face like she was heading to a funeral. Which, in a way, I guess she was. The funeral of our marriage, officiated by her own spectacularly bad decisions. At the door, she tried to give some kind of goodbye speech, probably something she'd been rehearsing in her head while she packed. But I raised my hand like a traffic cop, because honestly, what was there left to say? Sorry. She'd already said that. Goodbye? The situation spoke for itself. I love you. Those words had lost all meaning the moment she decided to share our bed with someone else. The door closed with a soft click, and just like that, 5 years of marriage was reduced to the sound of a latch catching. I stood there for a moment, half expecting to feel something dramatic. Relief, anger, crushing sadness, maybe all 3 at once. Instead, I felt oddly empty, like someone had scooped out all my emotions with a melon baller and left me running on nothing but autopilot. Mr. Whitmore, our 70-something neighbor, was doing some aggressive rose trimming in his front yard, which was his polite way of keeping an eye on the drama unfolding next door. When our eyes met across the fence, he gave me a small nod. Not sympathy, not pity, just acknowledgement from one man to another. He didn't say a word, didn't offer any platitudes about how things would get better or how I was better off without her. I was grateful for that silence. Sometimes the best thing someone can do is just witness your disaster without trying to fix it or explain it away. Mr. Whitmore got that. Bless his nosy old soul. He just kept trimming his roses and pretending he wasn't watching my marriage officially die in real time. While I was busy watching my marriage get carted away in a rolling suitcase, Marina Voss was apparently conducting her own version of shock and awe about 3 miles across town. See, here's what I learned about Marina in the following weeks. When she said she didn't believe in screaming matches, what she really meant was that she believed in something far more terrifying. Systematic destruction delivered with the precision of a Swiss watch and the brutality of a medieval siege engine. Her lawyer, Victor Lang, turned out to be the kind of guy who probably ate opposing counsel for breakfast and used their tears as coffee creamer. Within 48 hours of our kitchen summit, he'd filed motions that would make a tax auditor weep with admiration. Asset freeze? Check. Expense trail subpoenas? Double check. Emergency orders that basically turned Adrian's financial life into a glass house, where everyone could see exactly how he'd been spending his money? Triple check with a cherry on top. The beautiful thing about rich people is that they always leave paper trails, because when you're used to buying your way out of problems, you tend to forget that credit cards are basically confession letters written in monthly installments. Victor's forensic accountant, a woman who probably got aroused by spreadsheets, started pulling apart Adrian's expenses like she was performing surgery on a budget. Hotel suites that were supposedly for client entertainment, but coincidentally happened on nights when Sienna was working late. Business gifts that turned out to be diamond earrings and designer handbags. A weekend at Lake Travis that was billed as executive team building, but seemed to have involved exactly 2 executives building something that definitely wasn't corporate synergy. Meanwhile, at Voss Dynamics, the dominoes were starting to fall like it was some kind of corporate Rube Goldberg machine designed by someone with a really twisted sense of justice. The company's internal audit department, those fun-loving folks who normally spent their days making sure people weren't stealing office supplies, suddenly found themselves investigating whether their CEO had been violating about 17 different sections of the employee handbook. Here's the thing about corporate America. Companies will tolerate a lot of crap from their executives. Cocaine habit? We'll send you to rehab. Embezzlement? We'll work out a payment plan. But screwing your employees while potentially exposing the company to sexual harassment lawsuits? That's when the corporate lawyers start sharpening their knives and the HR department starts updating their LinkedIn profiles. Adrian's legendary charm, which had apparently been working overtime to convince everyone that he was just a misunderstood visionary with a healthy appreciation for team building, suddenly stopped being quite so charming when it was being examined under the fluorescent lights of a conference room full of employment attorneys. Turns out that charisma doesn't translate well to incident reports and sworn depositions. The board chair, Avery Chun, a woman who looked like she could reduce grown men to tears just by adjusting her reading glasses, started asking the kind of questions that make CEOs break out in cold sweats. Questions like, how exactly do you define client entertainment in this context? And can you explain why this employee received performance bonuses that were significantly higher than her productivity metrics would justify? The kind of questions that don't have good answers when you've been thinking with your pants instead of your brain for the past 6 months. Meanwhile, in the legal system, Judge Elkins was signing off on Marina's initial orders like he was autographing baseballs, and Amara Quinn was filing my petition with the kind of professional satisfaction that probably came from knowing she was about to make someone very, very sorry they'd ever heard the word adultery. The beautiful thing about Texas divorce law is that it's not nearly as forgiving as some people think, especially when you've got video evidence and a paper trail that reads like a how-to guide for corporate sexual harassment. Adrian, bless his narcissistic little heart, tried to ride this out like it was just another business crisis that could be managed with the right PR firm and maybe a strategic donation to charity. He moved into some ridiculous luxury rental that probably cost more per month than most people's annual salaries. The kind of place with floor-to-ceiling windows and a view of the Austin skyline that was supposed to make you feel like a master of the universe. Instead, it just made him look like a guy who was hemorrhaging money while his life fell apart in real time. But here's where the whole great love affair narrative started falling apart faster than a house of cards in a hurricane. Turns out that sneaking around behind your spouse's backs is a lot more romantic than actually having to deal with each other in the harsh light of day. Sienna, who'd been couch surfing with various coworkers like some kind of corporate nomad, finally landed in a month-to-month studio apartment above a bar that apparently never heard of the concept of quiet hours. Nothing kills romance quite like having to split the cost of groceries and arguing about whose turn it is to take out the trash. Especially when you're both suddenly dealing with lawyers who charge more per hour than most people make in a week, and the realization that following your heart doesn't come with dental benefits or a 401k match. The cracks started showing pretty quickly. Jealous text messages about who Adrian was talking to at work functions. Arguments about money that escalated from whispered disagreements to full-blown shouting matches. Sienna apparently had some unrealistic expectations about what life with a disgrace-o was going to look like, while Adrian was discovering that maintaining 2 households and paying 2 sets of divorce attorneys was putting a serious dent in his master of the universe budget. The whole thing came to a head in a Whole Foods parking garage, because of course it did, because even their breakdowns had to be embarrassingly Austin, where they had a screaming match that ended with Adrian throwing Sienna's phone against a concrete pillar. Witnesses reported that the conversation involved a lot of words that probably aren't typically heard in the organic produce section, along with some accusations about financial responsibility and emotional availability that suggested their great love was more like great mutual self-destruction. The shattered phone became a perfect metaphor for their relationship: expensive, broken, and ultimately replaceable. Adrian stormed off in his BMW, probably muttering about ungrateful women and the unfairness of it all, while Sienna was left standing there surrounded by the scattered pieces of her device and, presumably, her illusions about what kind of life she'd thought she was signing up for. From my perspective, watching this unfold was like being a spectator at the world's most expensive train wreck. These were 2 people who'd blown up 4 lives because they thought they were smarter than everyone else, only to discover that infidelity is actually just another word for stupidity with better marketing. You know what they say about burning bridges? Sometimes you don't burn them. Sometimes you load them onto a truck and haul them to the city dump to watch industrial equipment turn them into compressed metal cubes. That's exactly what I did with our bedroom. And let me tell you, there's something deeply therapeutic about watching a garbage compactor swallow the bed where your wife screwed her boss. It's like closure, but with hydraulics and the satisfying crunch of particle board getting turned into recyclable materials. The whole mattress disposal adventure started about a week after Sienna moved out, when I realized I couldn't sleep in that room anymore without feeling like I was camping at the scene of a crime. Every time I looked at that bed, my brain helpfully supplied a high-definition replay of walking in on them, complete with surround sound and smell-o-vision. So I did what any rational person would do when faced with furniture that had been contaminated by infidelity. I rented a pickup truck and turned the whole thing into a one-man demolition project. Getting a king-size mattress and box spring down the stairs by yourself is basically like trying to wrestle an octopus made of fabric and springs, but I was running on pure spite and the kind of adrenaline that comes from finally doing something constructive with your rage. The bed frame came apart easier than my marriage had, which seemed fitting in a way that probably would have been poetic if I was the kind of guy who gave a shit about poetry right then. The dump was one of those places that makes you appreciate the simple beauty of industrial efficiency. Guys in hard hats operating machinery that could crush a car into a lunchbox. Mountains of discarded furniture and appliances that represented thousands of other people's life changes and fresh starts. When I watched that compactor grab my marital bed and turn it into something that looked like abstract art made of springs and regret, I felt lighter than I had in months. But destroying the evidence was only step one. Step two involved calling Gwen's crew, a bunch of guys who could make any room look like it belonged in a home improvement magazine, assuming you had the budget and the patience to let them work their magic. Gwen herself was this tiny woman who looked like she could bench press a refrigerator and probably had, judging by the way she sized up my bedroom like she was planning a military invasion. "You want to sand and refinish the whole floor?" she asked, running her hand across the hardwood like she was reading it for clues. "That's going to take about 3 days, and you're going to need somewhere else to sleep while we work." When I told her I'd been sleeping on the couch anyway, she just nodded like that made perfect sense, which I appreciated. No awkward questions about why a grown man was voluntarily camping out in his own living room. Watching them work was like seeing artists who specialized in erasing the past. The sanders stripped away years of scuff marks and scratches, along with whatever invisible traces of betrayal might have been soaked into the wood grain. The smell of sawdust and polyurethane was sharp and clean, nothing like the lingering cologne and lies that had been hanging in the air for months. While they worked on the floors, I went to Home Depot and spent about 3 hours staring at paint samples like they held the secrets of the universe. Sienna had always vetoed anything that wasn't some variation of beige or cream, claiming that neutral colors are timeless, and we want something that won't date the house. What she really meant was that she wanted something safe and boring, something that wouldn't offend potential buyers if we ever decided to sell. But we weren't selling anymore, and I wasn't interested in timeless. I was interested in mine. I picked a deep slate blue that looked like a thunderstorm, the kind of color that would make the room feel completely different from anything we'd shared. When I rolled that first stripe of paint onto the wall, it was like drawing a line between who I used to be and who I was becoming. Each stroke covered up not just the bland beige underneath, but 6 years of compromise and accommodation and pretending that neutral was the same thing as happy. The new bed was simple, just a heavy wooden frame that didn't squeak when you moved, didn't have any fancy headboard carved with flowers or other romantic bullshit, and came with a warranty that didn't depend on anyone else keeping their promises. I bought sheets that were soft and white and completely mine, pillows that had never supported anyone else's dreams or lies, and a comforter that would never need to be washed because someone else's perfume had gotten all over it. The first night I slept in that room after the renovation was like staying in a hotel that happened to be located in my own house. Everything was familiar but different, comfortable but not loaded with history. The walls were the color of deep water, the floors gleamed with fresh polyurethane, and the air smelled like new beginnings instead of old regrets. For the first time in months, I slept through the night without waking up reaching for someone who wasn't there anymore. But the bedroom was just the beginning. I started making other changes, small ones that probably wouldn't mean anything to anyone else, but felt revolutionary to me. I left my shoes by the front door without listening for lectures about tracking dirt through the house. I ate cereal for dinner while watching SportsCenter, because apparently that's what happens when you don't have to negotiate every meal like it's a peace treaty between warring nations. The remote control lived permanently on my side of the couch, and I could watch entire games without someone asking questions about the rules or sighing dramatically about how boring football was. I played music without headphones, left dishes in the sink overnight without feeling guilty, and discovered that living alone didn't mean being lonely. It meant being free to be myself without having to explain or justify every choice to someone who'd apparently been planning their exit strategy anyway. My manager Omar Shah noticed the difference at work, which either meant I'd been more obviously miserable than I thought, or that divorce had given me some kind of professional superpower. During a client recap meeting, he pulled me aside and said, "You seem more focused lately, more engaged." He was right, though I couldn't exactly explain that having your personal life explode had somehow made it easier to concentrate on quarterly projections and market analysis. The truth was, my mind felt clearer than it had in years. Without constantly worrying about whether Sienna was happy, whether I was doing enough, whether those late nights really were just about work, I could actually focus on the tasks in front of me. Problems that used to seem overwhelming suddenly looked manageable. Clients who used to intimidate me just looked like people who needed solutions I was perfectly capable of providing. It was like I'd been trying to solve math problems with half my brain tied behind my back, and suddenly someone had cut the ropes. The mental energy I'd been spending on denial and justification and trying to fix things that weren't actually broken was now available for more productive uses, like figuring out why our biggest account was hemorrhaging money and what we could do to stop the bleeding. For the first time in longer than I could remember, my life felt like it actually belonged to me. Turns out when you're not spending half your mental energy trying to decode whether your wife's working late again means she's actually working or just working on her boss's zipper, you discover you've got some serious untapped brain power just sitting around looking for something productive to do. Who knew? I sure as hell didn't. But apparently I'd been operating at about 60% capacity for months, maybe years, and suddenly having access to the full CPU was like upgrading from dial-up to fiber optic internet. Work stopped being this thing I did to pay bills and started being this thing I chose to engage with because, shock of all shocks, I was actually pretty good at it when I wasn't distracted by wondering why my wife had suddenly developed an allergic reaction to coming home before 10 p.m. Omar had been piling projects on my desk for years, probably because I was one of the few people who didn't immediately start whining about overtime or asking for additional resources every time something required actual effort. But now, instead of just grinding through assignments like I was serving time in a corporate prison, I started volunteering for the messy stuff. You know, the accounts that everyone else avoided because they were complicated or boring or involved clients who had the social skills of caffeinated badgers. There was this one account, Henderson Manufacturing, that had been bleeding money for 6 months and driving our entire team crazy because nobody could figure out why their profit margins were disappearing faster than free donuts in a police station. I spent 3 weeks diving into their books like I was hunting for buried treasure, cross-referencing invoices and purchase orders and vendor contracts until I found the problem. Their main supplier had been gradually increasing prices while simultaneously decreasing quality, but they'd been doing it so slowly that nobody noticed until the cumulative effects started showing up in quarterly reports. It was like financial death by 1,000 paper cuts, and once I pointed it out, the solution was obvious. Henderson's CEO was so grateful he sent me a bottle of bourbon that probably cost more than my car payment, and Omar started looking at me like I'd just performed some kind of workplace miracle instead of just doing basic math with a functioning brain. "You should take on the Meridian account too," he said, sliding another file folder across my desk like he was dealing cards in the world's most boring poker game. "They're having some supply chain issues that sound right up your alley." The weird thing was, I actually wanted to take it on. Not because I needed to prove anything or impress anyone, but because solving puzzles turned out to be satisfying when you weren't spending half your time wondering if your spouse was lying to your face about where she'd been and who she'd been with. Work became this clean, logical space where problems had actual solutions and success was measured in numbers that didn't lie or cheat or suddenly decide they needed space to find themselves. But here's the thing about having extra mental bandwidth. You start noticing that there's a whole world out there beyond your office cubicle and your imploding marriage. I'd been so focused on trying to hold my personal life together that I'd completely forgotten about the community center volunteer orientation I'd signed up for about 8 months ago, back when Sienna was going through her "we should give back more" phase. She'd lost interest after about 2 weeks, which should have been another red flag, but I kept meaning to follow up and just never got around to it. Ms. Chika Okoye ran the tutoring program like she was coordinating a military operation, but with more hugs and a lot more patience for kids who thought math was invented by Satan specifically to ruin their lives. She was one of those people who could look at a room full of fidgety 8-year-olds and somehow transform them into focused little scholars just by believing they were capable of more than they thought they were. "You're here for the homework help program?" she asked when I finally showed up on a Tuesday evening, probably looking like I'd gotten lost on my way to a midlife crisis convention. When I nodded and explained about the delayed follow-up, she just smiled and handed me a name tag like tardiness was just another problem with an obvious solution. Perfect timing. I've got 2 kids who could use someone with your background. That's how I met Zoe, who was 9 years old and had apparently decided that fractions were her personal enemy in a war she was determined to win through sheer stubbornness and creative applications of erasers. She had curly hair that defied gravity and the kind of direct honesty that only kids can pull off without seeming rude. "Are you married?" she asked during our second tutoring session, while we were working through a worksheet that involved dividing pizza slices in ways that somehow made math relevant to her daily life. I said, trying to figure out how to explain divorce to someone whose biggest relationship drama probably involved who got to sit where at the lunch table. "Did she unmarry you?" Zoe asked, which was probably the most accurate description of divorce I'd ever heard. "Yeah, she did." Zoe considered this information while chewing on her pencil eraser, which seemed to be her preferred method of processing complex emotional data. "That sucks," she finally concluded. "Are you sad?" "Sometimes," I said, which was the truth. "But I'm getting better." "Good," she said, turning back to her worksheet like that settled everything. "Will you still come on Tuesdays?" "I'll still come on Tuesdays," I promised, and I meant it. There was something refreshing about Zoe's approach to problem solving. Identify the issue, ask direct questions, figure out what needed to happen next, move forward. No drama, no hidden agendas, just practical solutions and enough flexibility to adapt when circumstances changed. The other kid I worked with was Marcus, who was 11 and had somehow gotten the idea that story problems were designed to trick him rather than teach him. He approached every math question like it was a riddle from a particularly devious sphinx, looking for the hidden catch that would make his answer wrong no matter what he did. Why can't they just ask, "What's 8 times 7, instead of making up some story about train schedules?" He complained during one particularly frustrating session involving word problems that somehow made multiplication more complicated by adding unnecessary narrative elements. Because real life doesn't usually give you problems in nice, clean packages, I told him. Most of the time, you have to figure out what question you're actually trying to answer before you can solve it. Which, now that I thought about it, was probably a lesson I could have used in my marriage. Maybe if I'd spent more time asking the right questions instead of just accepting the answers I was given, I would have figured out what was really going on a lot sooner. But that was the old Jude, the one who'd been operating in crisis management mode for so long that he'd forgotten what normal problem-solving felt like. The new Jude, the one who had time and mental energy for volunteer work and actually enjoyed helping kids figure out fractions, was discovering that life outside the disaster zone was pretty satisfying. Saturdays became about something completely different: hiking. I joined this trail group that met at Zilker Park every weekend, partly because I needed exercise that didn't involve running away from my problems, and partly because I was curious about whether I could handle being around people who didn't know anything about my recent personal catastrophe. Priya was a software engineer who talked about coding like other people talked about poetry, finding beauty in elegant algorithms and well-structured databases. Mateo worked for the city planning department and knew the history behind every bridge and building we passed on our hikes. Breyer was a freelance graphic designer who had strong opinions about font choices and could spot bad kerning from 50 yards away. They knew I was recently divorced because it came up naturally in conversation, but they didn't know about Adrian or Sienna or the whole sordid mess of betrayal and lawyers and corporate investigations. To them, I was just Jude, the guy who liked good coffee and quiet trails and could keep up a steady pace for 10 miles without complaining about the heat. After our hikes, we'd usually hit up this breakfast taco place that served coffee strong enough to wake the dead and breakfast tacos that could probably solve most of the world's problems if we could just figure out how to distribute them properly. We'd sit at picnic tables under oak trees, talking about nothing important and everything meaningful: work frustrations, weekend plans, random observations about Austin traffic, and whether the food truck scene was getting too commercialized. It was normal in a way I'd forgotten existed. No hidden agendas, no careful navigation around sensitive topics, no wondering if someone was telling me the truth or just telling me what they thought I wanted to hear. Just people being people, sharing breakfast tacos and trail mix, and the kind of easy conversation that happens when nobody's trying to impress anyone else or cover up anything they're ashamed of. For the first time in longer than I could remember, I was learning what it felt like to be around people who actually seemed to enjoy my company, not because they needed something from me or felt obligated to include me, but just because they genuinely liked having me around. It was a revelation wrapped in hiking boots and served with a side of salsa verde. My parents, Ruthie and Cal Carter, had this amazing superpower that I didn't fully appreciate until I was sitting in their kitchen on a Sunday afternoon, eating my mom's pozole and realizing they weren't asking me a single goddamn question about my spectacular marital implosion. Not one. No probing about how I was holding up. No gentle suggestions about counseling or giving Sienna another chance. No well-meaning, but ultimately useless advice about forgiveness being more for me than for her. Just regular Sunday lunch conversation about Dad's ongoing war with the neighbor's tree that kept dropping branches in their yard, Mom's book club's heated debate about whether the latest bestseller was genius or pretentious garbage, and whether the Longhorns had any shot at a decent season this year. It was like they'd collectively decided that what I needed wasn't analysis or intervention, but just the simple comfort of being treated like a normal human being instead of a victim of tragic circumstances. They asked about work, about whether I was eating enough vegetables, about whether I'd gotten that weird noise in my car checked out yet. Normal parent stuff that had absolutely nothing to do with my personal life being a smoking crater, and everything to do with the fact that I was still their kid, and they still cared about the mundane details that make up a life. When I finally got up to leave, Mom sent me home with enough pozole to feed a small army and a plant she'd been growing from a cutting that she was convinced I could keep alive despite my historically dismal track record with anything that required regular watering. It's a snake plant, she explained, like this was crucial information. Practically impossible to kill. Even you should be able to manage it. The confidence in that, even you, was both insulting and oddly reassuring. But the real game changer came from an unexpected source, Marina Voss, who had apparently become my unofficial divorce war correspondent. Her text updates were sparse and to the point, like battlefield reports from a commander who didn't have time for unnecessary details. Board escalated. Policy enforced. Settlement posture strong. Each message was like getting intelligence from the front lines of a conflict I was involved in, but didn't have to actively fight, which was exactly how I preferred it. The latest update had been particularly satisfying. Adrian's strategic sabbatical confirmed. Effective immediately, which was corporate speak for, your wife's boyfriend just got fired for being a sexual harassment lawsuit waiting to happen. Marina's legal team had apparently built such a comprehensive case that the board didn't just censure Adrian. They launched him into orbit like he was contaminated space debris. But even more satisfying than watching Adrian's professional life implode was discovering Dr. Rowan, a therapist who talked about boundaries like they were architectural features instead of psychological concepts. I'd expected therapy to be all about exploring my feelings and unpacking childhood trauma and other Oprah-approved methods of navel-gazing. Instead, Dr. Rowan treated boundaries like practical tools, the way a contractor might talk about load-bearing walls or proper electrical wiring. Think of boundaries as doors with locks that you control, she said during our third session, sitting in her office that looked more like a comfortable living room than a medical facility. You decide who gets keys, who gets invited in, and who doesn't even get to knock. She had me practice saying simple sentences that felt revolutionary in their directness. No, that doesn't work for me. I'm leaving now. Basic phrases that somehow I'd never learned to use without following them with extensive justification and apology. The homework she gave me was deceptively simple. Make a list of personal rules and stick to them for 1 week. Not goals or aspirations or things I hope to accomplish eventually, but actual rules with real consequences. The list I came up with felt both obvious and radical. Rule number 1, I do not explain my no. If someone asks me to do something and I don't want to do it, no is a complete sentence. I don't owe anyone a detailed breakdown of my reasoning, a cost-benefit analysis of my time, or a dissertation on why their request doesn't align with my priorities. No means no, period, end of discussion. Rule number 2, I do not chase people who hurt me. If someone decides they want to be out of my life, either through their actions or their choices, I'm not going to spend my energy trying to convince them otherwise. People show you who they are through their behavior, and when they show you they're willing to hurt you, believe them the first time. Rule number 3. I do not rescue what chooses to drown. This one was specifically about Sienna, but really applied to anyone who creates their own problems and then expects other people to fix them. If someone wants to make destructive choices, that's their right, but they don't get to make those choices my responsibility. The first time I had to use these rules was when Sienna called me about 2 weeks later, crying about how her landlord was being unreasonable about some damaged deposit issue, and could I please just talk to him, because I was so much better at handling these kinds of confrontations. The old Jude would have probably driven over there with a toolbox and a checkbook, ready to solve whatever problem she'd created through some combination of poor planning and magical thinking. The new Jude said, "That doesn't work for me," and hung up. She called back 3 times. I didn't answer. She left increasingly desperate voicemails explaining how this wasn't about us. This was just about being a decent human being to someone who was struggling. The 4th voicemail included some creative language about how I'd become cold and selfish since the divorce, as if basic self-preservation was somehow a character flaw. I deleted all the messages without listening to them completely and went about my day. It felt weird, like I was wearing clothes that didn't quite fit, but it also felt powerful in a way that was completely unfamiliar. For the first time in years, I was choosing what problems deserved my attention, and surprise, surprise, other people's self-created emergencies didn't make the cut. The same rules applied to work, where I discovered that saying, "I'm not available for evening calls unless it's a genuine emergency," didn't result in my immediate termination or professional exile. Instead, people just adjusted their expectations and started planning their crises during business hours like functional adults. Amazing how that worked. Dr. Rowan explained that boundaries aren't walls meant to keep everyone out. They're more like property lines that let people know where they stand and what the rules are for being in your space. Good boundaries actually make relationships better, she said, because everyone knows what to expect. People can't violate rules they don't know exist, and you can't get angry at them for crossing lines you never drew. The snake plant my mother had given me became a weird symbol of this whole boundary thing. I put it in my home office, right next to my diplomas and my childhood baseball card collection. Things that were mine, that represented my interests and achievements and the parts of my life that had nothing to do with anyone else's approval or participation. Every morning when I saw that plant still being alive, it felt like a small victory over my historical inability to take care of things that depended on me. But the biggest test came when my cousin Derek invited me to his wedding, which was happening in 2 months and would inevitably involve questions about Sienna, sympathetic looks from relatives who'd heard about the divorce through the family gossip network, and probably some well-meaning aunt asking when I was going to get back out there, like dating was some kind of recreational sport I'd temporarily quit. The old Jude would have spent weeks dreading it, maybe even skipped it entirely to avoid the awkwardness. The new Jude RSVP'd yes, bought Derek a nice gift from his registry, and started mentally preparing responses to the inevitable questions that would be both truthful and brief. The marriage didn't work out. "I'm doing well. Thanks for asking." Complete sentences that didn't invite further discussion or require detailed explanation. Because here's what I was learning. Most people who ask personal questions aren't actually looking for honest answers. They're just making conversation or satisfying their own curiosity. They don't need to know about Adrian Voss or the video or the credit card receipts or any of the gory details that had consumed my life for the past several months. They just need to know that I'm okay, that I'm handling my business, and that I'm not going to make things weird by oversharing about my personal disasters. The wedding would be a test run for the new version of myself. The guy who could attend social functions without feeling like he had to explain or justify his life choices to people who weren't actually invested in the answers anyway. The first holiday season after your marriage explodes is weird in the same way that losing a limb is probably weird. You keep reaching for something that isn't there anymore, expecting traditions that no longer exist, and realizing how many of your automatic responses were built around someone else's presence. But here's the thing nobody tells you. Once you get past the initial weirdness, holidays without drama are actually kind of amazing. No negotiations about whose family to visit first. No passive-aggressive comments about gift budgets. No theatrical sighs about how commercial everything has become while simultaneously demanding the perfect Instagram-worthy Christmas morning. I discovered this revelation sometime around Thanksgiving, when I realized I could spend the entire day in my pajamas watching football without someone making pointed comments about how we should probably do something special, or maybe we could invite people over this year. Instead, I made a turkey sandwich, opened a beer at noon because I'm a grown-ass adult and it was a holiday, and watched the Cowboys lose in spectacular fashion without having to pretend I cared about the halftime show or explain why third and long was significant to someone who was only paying attention when the commercials came on. But the real game changer was Christmas shopping, which had always been this elaborate psychological warfare where every purchase was somehow both too expensive and not thoughtful enough, too practical and not romantic enough, too much effort and not enough effort, depending on Sienna's mood and whatever magazine article she'd read about love languages that week. This year, I bought exactly what I wanted to buy for the people I actually cared about: a decent bottle of bourbon for my dad, a cookbook about Mexican street food for my mom, gift cards for my hiking buddies, and toys for the kids at the community center. No spreadsheets, no stress, no wondering whether the person receiving the gift would interpret it as some kind of coded message about the state of our relationship. Just simple transactions based on knowing what people actually liked and having enough money to buy it without feeling guilty about the expense or resentful about the obligation. The house itself became a completely different kind of space during the holidays. Instead of turning it into some kind of magazine-worthy winter wonderland that required 3 weeks of planning and a detailed lighting scheme, I bought a small tree that fit perfectly in the corner of the living room, hung some lights that didn't require an engineering degree to install, and called it done. No themed ornament collections, no matching color schemes, no elaborate centerpieces that cost more than most people's car payments. And you know what? It was perfect. The tree smelled like Christmas, the lights were warm and cheerful, and I could enjoy the whole thing without worrying about whether it met someone else's standards for holiday excellence. I even bought myself a ridiculously expensive espresso machine, the kind of purchase that would have required a family meeting and extensive justification back when I was married, but now just required swiping my credit card and finding a place for it on the kitchen counter. That espresso machine became symbolic of something larger. The permission to enjoy things simply because they brought me joy, not because they served some greater purpose or fit into someone else's vision of what my life should look like. Every morning when I made my coffee with beans I'd ground myself, in a machine that made sounds like a small aircraft taking off, I felt like I was giving myself a gift that no one could take away or complain about or use as evidence that I was being selfish with money. The living room got a similar treatment when I replaced our old, uncomfortable couch, chosen because it photographed well and went with everything. With a massive sectional that was so soft you could disappear into it for hours. It was the kind of furniture that prioritized comfort over aesthetics, function over form, and personal preference over what looked good to other people. I could sprawl across the entire thing watching Netflix, take naps that lasted 3 hours, and not worry about whether the cushions looked presentable if someone stopped by unexpectedly. My home office became a shrine to things that actually mattered to me, instead of being carefully curated to present the right image to visitors who never came anyway. I hung my college diplomas on the wall, not because they impressed anyone, but because I'd worked hard for them and they represented something I was proud of. My childhood baseball card collection, which had been banished to a closet because it was too juvenile for a grown man's office, got a place of honor on the bookshelf next to leadership manuals and industry publications. Work started reflecting these changes too, in ways that surprised everyone, including me. Omar Shah pulled me into his office right before Christmas with news that felt surreal: a promotion, a significant raise, and responsibility for the firm's biggest client portfolio. "You've been different this year," he said, leaning back in his chair like he was trying to figure out what had changed. "More decisive, more confident. Whatever you're doing, keep doing it." What I was doing was showing up as myself instead of as some carefully constructed version of myself designed to avoid conflict and manage other people's emotions. When clients asked for my opinion, I gave it directly instead of hedging everything with qualifiers and escape clauses. When team meetings got bogged down in endless discussion, I moved things forward with actual decisions instead of waiting for consensus that would never come. When problems needed solving, I solved them instead of forming committees to study the feasibility of maybe addressing them eventually. The team I inherited responded to this approach like they'd been waiting their whole careers for someone to just tell them what needed to happen and trust them to figure out how to make it happen. I took them to El Molino, Austin's most no-nonsense Tex-Mex place, and laid out 3 simple rules. Clear timelines, no heroics, and tell the truth early. No elaborate mission statements, no team-building exercises, no motivational speeches about synergy and paradigm shifts. Just basic expectations that treated them like competent adults instead of children who needed constant supervision and encouragement. The result was a team that got calmer and faster, more efficient and less stressed, because they knew exactly what was expected of them and didn't have to spend time guessing what I really meant or trying to read between the lines of carefully diplomatic language. When Priya asked if I was dating during one of our post-hike breakfast taco sessions, I told her lightly, which was both completely true and completely sufficient as an answer. I wasn't shopping for forever, wasn't looking for someone to complete me or fix the parts of my life that felt empty. I was practicing joy, figuring out what actually made me happy instead of what I thought should make me happy, learning to enjoy my own company instead of constantly seeking external validation, discovering that contentment could come from simple things like perfectly brewed coffee and Sunday afternoon naps on a couch that felt like being hugged by a cloud. The holidays passed quietly and peacefully, without drama or disappointment or the exhausting emotional labor of managing someone else's expectations while pretending my own didn't matter. For the first time in years, January felt like a beginning instead of just another month of the same old compromises and accommodations that had been slowly strangling the life out of me. 3 years is exactly long enough for the sharp edges of catastrophe to wear smooth, for the daily reminders of what you lost to fade into the background noise of a life that's learned to function without them. 3 years is how long it takes for running into your ex-wife's friend in the cereal aisle at H-E-B to feel like a minor inconvenience instead of a major emotional event, which is exactly what happened on a Tuesday evening when I was trying to decide between Honey Nut Cheerios and some organic cardboard that claimed to be good for my digestive health. Katrina had been one of Sienna's closest friends back when I still thought I knew who Sienna was. Back when we'd have them over for dinner parties where everyone pretended to care about wine pairings and made small talk about home renovation projects and vacation plans. She looked exactly the same. Carefully maintained hair, designer workout clothes that probably cost more than most people's monthly grocery budget, and that particular Austin blend of wellness culture and subtle competitiveness that made every conversation feel like a performance. "Jude," she said, with the kind of enthusiasm usually reserved for lottery winners or people who'd just discovered they weren't dying after all. "Oh my God, you look amazing. Like, really amazing. Have you been working out? You seem so, I don't know, centered." The truth was, I did feel good. Not in the desperate, overcompensating way that divorced guys sometimes throw themselves into CrossFit or motorcycle ownership, but in the quiet, sustainable way that comes from actually liking the life you've built instead of just enduring it. I'd been hiking regularly for 3 years now, eating food that tasted good instead of food that photographed well, sleeping 8 hours a night on sheets I'd picked out myself, and generally treating my body like it belonged to someone I cared about instead of someone I was constantly disappointed in. "I'm doing well," I said, which was both completely true and completely sufficient. No need to elaborate on the journey, the therapy, the boundaries, or the slow process of learning to be happy without needing someone else's permission first. But Katrina wasn't done mining for information, because apparently seeing your friend's ex-husband thriving in the wild was some kind of social curiosity that needed to be satisfied. "Do you ever hear from Sienna?" she asked, lowering her voice like we were discussing state secrets instead of basic post-divorce logistics. "No," I said, and realized as the word came out of my mouth that it was both completely accurate and completely peaceful. I didn't hear from Sienna, didn't think about Sienna, didn't wonder what Sienna was doing or whether she was happy or sorry or successful in whatever life she'd built after blowing up ours. It wasn't that I wished her ill, it was more that she'd become irrelevant to my daily existence. The way high school classmates become irrelevant once you realize you're never going to see them again and don't particularly want to. The lack of curiosity surprised even me. For the first year after the divorce, I'd been obsessed with intelligence gathering, checking social media like a stalker, asking mutual friends casual questions that weren't actually casual at all. But somewhere along the way, that obsession had just evaporated. Like waking up one day and realizing you no longer cared whether your favorite TV show got renewed, because you'd found better things to watch. Katrina seemed to take my indifference as an invitation to provide updates anyway, the way people always do when they think they're giving you information you want, but are too proud to ask for directly. She's doing okay, I think. She moved to Dallas for a while, then came back, then took this marketing job at some startup downtown. You know how it is with startups. Lots of equity promises, not so much actual money. She paused, probably waiting for me to show some sign of interest or concern or vindication, but I was mostly just wondering whether the organic cereal was worth an extra $3 for the privilege of eating cardboard that claimed to support sustainable farming practices. As for Adrian, she continued, apparently determined to provide a complete status report on everyone who'd participated in the destruction of my first marriage. I heard he took some kind of strategic sabbatical after that whole thing with the board review. Marina's foundation doubled their STEM scholarships, though, so I guess something good came out of all that mess. This was the first I'd heard about Marina's foundation expansion, and it made me smile in a way that probably looked mysterious to Katrina, but was actually just genuine appreciation for a woman who'd turned personal betrayal into public good. Marina Voss had taken the energy she could have spent on revenge and channeled it into something that would help kids get better educations. It was exactly the kind of move I'd expect from someone who treated life like a chess game and was always thinking 3 moves ahead. The conversation wrapped up with the usual pleasantries and promises to stay in touch that we both knew were polite fiction, and I finished my grocery shopping with the strange realization that running into Sienna's friend had felt about as emotionally significant as running into my mailman. Pleasant enough, briefly informative, but ultimately just another minor interaction in a day full of minor interactions. Driving home, I thought about how weird it was that 3 years ago, that conversation would have ruined my entire week. I would have spent hours analyzing every word, wondering what Sienna had said about me, whether she was happy or struggling, whether she ever thought about what we'd had and lost. Now it was just information that didn't particularly affect me one way or another, like hearing about the weather in a city I'd never visit. My house looked exactly like what it was, a place where someone lived who knew what he liked and wasn't ashamed of it. The slate blue bedroom that had felt revolutionary 3 years ago now just felt like home. The expensive espresso machine had earned its place on the counter by making thousands of perfect cups of coffee. The massive sectional had supported countless naps, movie marathons, and Sunday afternoons spent reading books that nobody else had to approve of or pretend to find interesting. But the real transformation was in the smaller details, the ones that only I would notice. The way I could leave dishes in the sink overnight without feeling guilty about it. The way I could spend an entire Saturday doing absolutely nothing productive without someone making comments about wasted time or missed opportunities. The way I could buy groceries based on what I actually wanted to eat instead of what would photograph well for social media or impress dinner guests who were probably too polite to admit they didn't like quinoa any more than I did. That evening, I sat on my back porch with a perfect cup of espresso, watching the sky turn that particular shade of pink that only happens in Texas during the 20 minutes between day and night. The air was warm enough that I didn't need a jacket, cool enough that sitting outside felt like a choice instead of an endurance test. Somewhere in the distance, I could hear kids playing in someone's backyard, the sound of laughter and splash fights that meant summer was officially here and school was officially out. I'd set out my trail shoes for the next morning's hike, because Wednesday mornings had become my favorite time to hit the greenbelt before the heat got too oppressive and the trails got too crowded with people who treated hiking like a competitive sport instead of a moving meditation. Priya, Mateo, and Briar would be there, probably arguing about whether breakfast tacos from the gas station counted as authentic Austin cuisine, definitely planning whatever weekend adventure they'd talk me into this time. My phone buzzed with a text from Ms. Chica Okie asking if I could cover Thursday tutoring because one of the other volunteers had a family emergency, and I texted back, of course, without even checking my calendar first. Thursday tutoring meant helping Marcus with his summer reading and listening to Zoe explain whatever scientific phenomenon she'd discovered on YouTube that week. It meant being the kind of adult who showed up consistently, who kept promises, who treated other people's problems like they mattered. The house was quiet but full, empty of other people, but completely occupied by a life that fit me like clothes I'd had tailored instead of bought off the rack. Every room reflected choices I'd made for reasons that made sense to me, from the diplomas on the office wall to the baseball cards that had finally found their way out of storage to the snake plant that had not only survived but actually thrived under my care, growing new shoots like a green middle finger to everyone who'd ever suggested I couldn't take care of anything that depended on me. 3 years had taught me that the best revenge isn't their suffering. It's this life that fits like a perfectly broken-in pair of boots, comfortable and sturdy and ready for whatever terrain comes next. It's the discovery that happiness doesn't require anyone else's participation or approval. That contentment can come from simple things like good coffee and quiet evenings and the satisfaction of showing up for people who need you to show up. Sienna and Adrian had blown up for lives because they thought they deserved something more exciting than what they had. Something that felt more like the movies and less like real life with its mundane pleasures and ordinary commitments. They'd chased drama and passion and the thrill of secrets and stolen moments. And from what I could tell, they'd ended up with exactly what that kind of thinking usually gets you. Chaos, complications, and the kind of happiness that requires constant maintenance and validation from other people. Meanwhile, I'd learned to find joy in things that didn't require anyone else's cooperation. The perfect espresso, the satisfaction of a problem solved at work, the feeling of strong legs carrying me up a difficult trail, the simple pleasure of being exactly where I wanted to be instead of pretending to be somewhere else. I'd built a life that belonged entirely to me, that couldn't be taken away by someone else's bad decisions or midlife crisis or sudden discovery that they'd rather be with someone else. The kids I tutored would grow up and probably forget my name, but maybe they'd remember that adults sometimes kept their promises. The hiking group might drift apart as people moved and changed and found new interests, but we'd have had these perfect Saturday mornings together, sharing breakfast tacos and bad jokes, and the simple pleasure of walking through beautiful places with people whose company we enjoyed. My parents would continue to send me home with too much food and plants I might or might not kill, treating me like their son instead of a victim of circumstances beyond his control. Work would continue to reward me for showing up as myself instead of as some carefully constructed version of myself designed to avoid conflict and manage other people's emotions. And I would continue to wake up each morning in a house that felt like home, in a life that felt like mine, surrounded by choices that made sense and relationships that didn't require constant negotiation or management or apology. The best part wasn't that I'd won or that they'd lost. It was that I'd stopped keeping score entirely, stopped measuring my happiness against anyone else's success or failure, stopped caring whether the people who'd hurt me were thriving or struggling somewhere else in a life that had nothing to do with me anymore. 3 years in light. That's what recovery looked like. Not the absence of darkness, but the presence of illumination that came from finally understanding what you actually needed instead of what you thought you were supposed to want.